Hello world! So here we are with another homework. This is going to be our G Sheets homework 3. So we're working in Python dealing with our Google Sheets. We're just going on what we did last week in class. So this is our G Sheets 5. Here we have our function for our longitude as well as our function for inputting latitude from our user. What we're going to do is what we talked about actually last week is to do some input verifications. So when the user inputs data, for one, it won't be something outside of the range that we want, and it can't be something invalid. So I'm just going to switch this here, and I'm showing all the code because this has some stuff that we need to specifically have in here accurately. Okay, so here what we have here is this function, just as we saw back here with G Sheets 5 that everybody's used to from doing it in class. We just took a raw input straight from the keyboard, straight from the user. Now I'm going to do some input verification on that. So here's my input log. Okay, what we're actually doing is starting a loop. So we're going to ask the user to input G or H because we know from our spreadsheet we're just focusing on those two columns of G and H is what we're working on right now. So initially I'm inputting or I'm initializing this long as a variable string since we're taking raw input because we're using Python 1 with our G Sheets library. So I'm just here within my loop. So I open the loop, then I start long equals string, and then I say long equals raw input, and then I'm doing this question to the user. Just like we had before is they input your longitude. However, I'm now indicating I want only G or H. Okay, so here we're able to make sure that the user is inputting either G or H. So if long.lower not in G or H, print not an appropriate choice, else. So basically, if they put G or H in there, it's just going to print this out and go back to asking for input. Okay. Now, if it is either G or H, we hit our else because it is in it as opposed to this not in. Since it is in, we hit this else. Inside of our else is this break. If you remember from a couple of weeks ago, break means we're breaking outside of our loop. So this is just while true. Otherwise, this will run forever since true is always going to be true. Once we hit the break, it jumps out of it and goes back to our return long, just like we had previously. Okay? So as opposed to just a simple input where you can choose even A or B or C or X, for example, we want to make sure the user is only going to input G or H. Okay? Now moving down is the input latitude. So before we had the same concept here, was just lat equals raw input. Since we are using Python 1, input your latitude. Now we're going to do the same concept here was we initialize a while loop. We're just saying the while true. So again, true is always true. So this is going to loop continuously until the user gets it right. What I'm doing here is I'm taking this latitude and I'm taking an input as an integer. Remember the difference between integers, strings, and floats. We're taking an int, and this is a local. Okay, lat is our variable, integer, input from user, and this is the thing that's actually going to print out on the screen. One thing to note here is make sure you are putting that space at the end because we've seen a lot of times we'll have outputs asking for inputs without a space and just kind of gets kabobbled there. Yes, that is a technical term. So let's go back over this again real quick. The lat equals int, input your latitude. Now since we have it formatted the way we do on our spreadsheet, we want only 2 through 11. Okay? So if latitude is less than 2, print latitude must be greater than 1. Continue. That means continue the loop. Okay? If latitude is greater than 11, which remember we want between 2 and 11, if it's greater than 11, such as 12 or 1,462, then it's going to print out latitude must be less than 12. Okay, so this way we guarantee that our input is 2 through 11. That way it stays within our specific block we're trying to work with, so we make sure the user is giving us something specific within the cells that we're going to be reading and writing to. Because remember, if it is a 0 or a 1, we can make a decision based on it. However, if it's anything else, it can have an error, such as if it's blank, it can have an error because it's not going to be a 0 or 1, and we can't do calculations on it, such as when we're back over here, okay? So anyway, getting back to the input latitude. So if latitude less than 2, print out latitude must be greater than 1. If latitude greater than 11, print out latitude must be less than 12. Continue this loop, else, which essentially, just as my notes here, or my comments here says, the else will indicate that latitude is 2 through 11 and thus valid. That's where our break comes into play. Okay, now this is a thing to pay attention to here, and this is a little bit more unique when we're doing a return. So as you notice, we're inputting this variable as an integer. However, as you notice over here, for example, we'll just jump to the next function of the check cell. Since we're working with the G-Sheets library, okay, we are taking the value of the cell, so that will be an integer. However, with that library expects to work with strings. And we saw that before when we had to do some adjustments. But what we need to be able to send it is a string of the longitude as well as a string, even though it is a number, a string of the latitude. Therefore, when we return string, or when we return latitude, it has to be as a string. So again, here we're inputting latitude as an integer. That is 2 through 11. And then we are going to continue if it's invalid. If it is valid, being between 2 and 11, we are breaking our while loop. And since that's the only thing in this function, we are now going to return a string of the integer latitude. That way, when we come all the way back down to our function call for latitude, this lat is a string. So when we send it to the target cell, which is what the function we just looked at here before, when we send it to this, we're able to send these strings of long and lat to our G-Sheets. That's just the way that the G-Sheet systems work, so we have to make sure we give it the proper type of variable since we are sending it a variable and a variable to pick out that specific cell. And I'll bring that up here just so we can show this on the video. For example, this is the Eli sheet, okay? So we want to make sure we have between G and H as well as 2 and 11. If we have F11, for example, it's not going to work, and there's nothing in that cell. So that's just simply not going to work in our program. Okay. Now let's bring the code back up here. And I will execute this program so we can see how this is supposed to work. I'll run the program. Game loading. Make sure we have the game loading so we have a little bit of an introduction screen. Who would you like to play with? I'm going to play with Eli. Loading Eli. So here's this question of enter G or H. So what we want to make sure is the user inputs something proper. If I push F, for example, it simply says not an appropriate choice. I can hit U, not an appropriate choice. However, if I do hit G, it allows me to push through. It does the next function call for input latitude. Now let's scroll this down so we can focus on what's here. Our input latitude function requires me to have an input between 2 and 11. If I choose 1, for example, it will say latitude must be greater than 1. And we can see that here where it says if lat less than 2, print latitude must be greater than 1. For the sake of it, let's make the other if statement valid. So I'm going to input 22. Latitude must be less than 12. So that's, again, making sure the user is inputting between 2 and 11. So I'll just go ahead and hit 4. Let's bring back my spreadsheet. Here is my spreadsheet. Here's my Python program. So I chose G4. We'll see that is a 1, and therefore through the rest of the program, as we know, 1 equals hit. I'll hit enter. It does our input. It was 1. It drops our X on there, so it knows it's been shot. And since it was 1, it turns it red. We output to our screen, hit, and that's the first time we've gone through. We'll do it again, H6. That's my second shot, and that is also a hit. Okay, so pretty simplistic, just a little bit of change from what we had on the last program from our last class. We're just adding some user verification or user input verification here. That way we make sure all the data that we're putting into the program is going to be valid and going to work with our spreadsheet. Hopefully that's not too difficult. If you do have questions, feel free to reach out over our chat program, and hopefully you learned something. Have a great night.